Hello, this is a lecture on independence in Latin America, and it comes in the middle of a unit on the Atlantic Revolution. So this would be the Latin American revolutions, which follow the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, and that leads to Napoleon, which eventually leads to the Latin American revolutions. The late colonial period in Latin America was one where the Spanish had done a lot of damage to Latin America. Obviously, they had caused the death of perhaps 90% of Native Americans in the American continent through disease and dislocation and new animals and exploitation and just general abuse. However, the Spanish also really badly ran their colonial empire. The Spanish were an extremely conservative society, absolutist monarch. They had terrible economic policies and basically just saw Latin America as something from which they could extract an enormous amount of wealth through things like slavery and sugar and various other crops, and also using Native American labor through the encomienda and various other labor schemes that basically forced Native Americans to work as sort of part-time slaves slash half serfs for the Spaniards. And by the time imperialism or Spanish colonialism starts to come to an end, you really see a Latin American society that is broken into castes, basically, sections, where you have the Peninsulares, the Spaniards from Spain, at the absolute top in charge of everything. The Creoles, the local all white, I guess you would put it, Spaniards or Portuguese in the case of Brazil, who are not in any way mixed blood people. Those people were, for the Americas, on top, although were seen as lesser by the Peninsulares, the Spaniards from Spain. And then you had various levels of mixed blood people. And there's a lot of language there that gets, in modern terms, it's seen as racist. But you definitely had mestizos, people who were mixed, all over the Americas. You had also mulattoes, people who'd be mixed between people of African ancestries and various other kinds of things. And then obviously you had the actual African slave population and also the many, many versions and tribes of Native American people throughout the Americas. Many of the triggers of the Latin American revolutions are deeply related to the triggers around the American Revolution and particularly around the French Revolution, especially through Napoleon. And one of those things that led to the Latin American revolutions was, like everywhere else, the spirit of the Enlightenment. These ideas that were out there about freedom, equality, and justice, and due process, and freedom of religion, and all these things that had been a big deal in the American and then in the French revolutions. Those ideas were common-ish in the Latin American colonies of Spain and also Portugal. In that region, though, however, the Enlightenment hadn't penetrated nearly so deeply, largely because you had a very small group of literate people who were extremely elite, the Creoles and the Peninsulares and the extremely well-connected mestizos. And so, the Enlightenment didn't really, trickle into larger society very heavily, because certainly, had slaves known about the Enlightenment, they might have been a little angry about slavery, for yet another reason. And obviously, Native Americans, or Indios in Spanish, were not seen as, were not people who would have been tied into the Enlightenment. That wasn't on their radar of things that they had time to worry about. However, the Enlightenment was going on. You also saw the rise of a whole sense of free trade that was at its heart a thing that came out of Britain and then was put into practice really heavily by the United States, the new United States, which was all about low taxation, free markets, free trade. And that was interesting to the Latin Americans of all groups, because that would have allowed them to stop being tied to this weak economy of Spain or of Portugal and start trading more with other people, particularly the British and the Americans, who were seen as a better market, willing to pay more. People hadn't yet realized what neocolonialism could be when money would replace straight-out armies and stuff like that to control you. But so there was a lot of appeal to this idea of free markets and being able to trade in the exact same way that the Americans were tired of supporting Britain and wanted to have an independence for themselves in the 13 colonies where they could trade freely and be free. Certainly that same economic concept was popular in Latin America. And the final big tension or trigger that came out of the rest of the Atlantic revolutions for the American revolutions, the Latin American revolutions, was basically just Napoleon. When Napoleon took over in the French Revolution and kind of both solidified the revolution and also turned it into a dictatorship and the largest war the world had ever seen, he also did dislocate Spanish and Portuguese power. So when Napoleon conquered Spain and for a while had control of Portugal effectively, that forced the royal families of those two countries to lose control of the Americas. The Portuguese monarchy actually moved to Brazil and would later declare independence from Portugal as like a kingdom, which is kind of reverse independence. Actually, they kind of kicked Portugal out. But for the rest of Latin America, there they just saw a power vacuum at the top. There was no king of Spain, or if there was a king of Spain, he was the brother of Napoleon, and therefore totally uninteresting to them as someone to follow. And so without the Spanish armies and the Spanish navy there to enforce imperialism or colonial control of the Americas, colony after colony, Venezuela, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, Chile, all those places began to realize, like, we can be free, and they took that opportunity to become free. The final sort of trigger to the Latin American revolutions is the Haitian Revolution, which is in many ways a Latin American revolution, although obviously Haiti is a French colony, and it's a very unique revolution, so it doesn't really fit in with the other ones, because the Haitian Revolution was at its heart a slave revolt against France and against white slave owners. That revolution in Haiti started out with some support from France, particularly in the radical revolutionary phase, where there was a sense of like equality, and the Haitian people, mostly ex-slave Africans, took that equality extremely seriously. And so then when the French tried to return Africans to slavery, that led to the much, much more aggressive revolution that actually was successful in bringing independence to Haitian people. Toussaint Louverture, the first leader, was killed. Dessalines, the second one, was much more efficient and effective. And so Haiti became the second free nation in the Americas after the United States of America. Haiti then became kind of a place where you could hide out if you were a Latin American revolutionary, meet on free soil, and it was also really seen as a spark in many ways in the Americas that, you know, if Haiti could become free, a place that was literally a slave revolt, like how could it be that the supposedly more developed and better led, supposedly, Latin American colonies could not also become free? So Haiti really was seen as a beacon by these other places, and also a place of refuge when they needed to hide from the Spanish for a short period of time here and there, and possibly also buy arms or cache arms, store arms for the later revolutions. The South American revolutions saw two primary leaders, Simón Bolívar coming out of Venezuela, who eventually will unite and control for a short period of time all of the Spanish-speaking side, the western side of South America. And then in Argentina and eventually into Chile, you saw a general named San Martin, who is also fighting, although Bolivar, for good reason, tends to get more of the credit there, because he really was the sort of bigger deal there. So Simón Bolivar in 1811, begins to fight against the Spanish, and that is an epic story, complete with like crazy escapes and marches over mountains and the whole bit. That takes a very long time. It takes until 1824, if I remember correctly, for Bolivar to finally manage to kick the Spaniards out of South America with the help of San Martin coming out of Argentina. Basically, the two of them kind of conquer their way to the middle in Peru and Bolivia, and eventually chase the Spanish out, the last armies out, and the Spaniards then give up on Latin America. And in the process, Simón Bolívar attempts to build something that he wanted to call Gran Colombia, which would be a kind of United States of South America, and very intentionally modeled that on big parts of the American Revolution. There's a lot of the Bill of Rights is very similar between the two constitutions that you first see. And Bolivar also had this idea that there could be a federal system in South America, so that places like Venezuela and Colombia and Chile and Ecuador and Argentina would all be states, just like they are in the United States of North America, except in South America. And it was a nice dream. It failed. Basically, even after the victory, and Bolivar was seen as this great hero, which he clearly was, and a military genius to boot. A lot of local power holders in Peru and Venezuela and Colombia and everywhere else just kind of realized that, yeah, it was a cool idea to have, this United States of South America, but South America was a lot bigger than the first version of the United States of America and North America. We were just 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard, easy to transport people back and forth because you could just sail up and down the coast. There were, at that time, no big mountain ranges separating states or anything like that. Whereas South America really was this massive undertaking to get around. You had the Andes Mountains running down the spine of the continent. You had giant rainforests. You had no simple-sided coast that you could sail up and down. It was just a way bigger place. Native American tribes were also a way bigger deal in Latin America than they were in the United States of America. We were in the process of dislocating and attempting to eliminate our Native American hosts. Whereas in Latin America, that just wasn't going to be a possibility. There were just far too many people, even for, had elite white people wanted to have a kind of revolution like that, they couldn't have. And so basically, although the goal was to create a Gran Colombia, United States of South America, it fails. And instead you end up with what you have, which is a whole lot of independent countries, all modeled on things like the United States or to some extent on France, similar rights, similar forms of government, but definitely not a single country. Mexican independence in that same period is a kind of more complicated deal in some ways, because Mexico is just a more complicated place in my mind, anyway, because I'm a Latin American history major with a focus in Mexico. But the Mexican Revolution of Independence starts differently. It doesn't start with someone like Simón Bolívar, a kind of Creole elite leader who can gather a lot of support from other wealthy Creoles in Latin America. Instead, the Mexican Revolution starts with Native American groups, by and large, organized by priests at first, Hidalgo and Morelos in 1810, and they fail. Hidalgo tries to have this kind of like egalitarian, very pro Native American revolution that would kind of return land and equality to the people who deserved it. Not like some kind of Indian race war or something, although that's what his opponents said of him, but certainly a very kind of French sort of the version of the revolution, taking something of the ideals of equality to their extreme. And the white people of Mexico were not having that. Creoles, Peninsulares, light-skinned mestizos were not interested in a heavily Native American independence movement. They saw their own selves as quite threatened. And so Hidalgo is killed, and that version of the revolution is actually put down primarily by locals, by actual Mexicans, just light-skinned Mexicans. And then Hidalgo's buddy, Morelos, the other priest, is a way better general and runs a guerrilla war that really heavily sucks the soul out of the Spaniards, who were already broken from the Napoleonic invasion. And even after they become independent again, after Napoleon is defeated, there's just not the money or the power really to bring Mexico back into the fold in any meaningful way. And so finally, under Agustin Iturbide, you get a Mexican elite Creole leader who decides that he wants to make Mexico independent, basically for lighter-skinned elites. And that also happens in South America. It's just kind of brutal to see that happen in Mexico after the original push for the revolutionary equality was from Hidalgo and from a much more Native American point of view, a much more egalitarian point of view. So Eventually, Mexico does become a place that's a far more decent place than it was under De Iturbide, but they don't start out terribly well, although they are independent. And so by 1824, all of the Spanish-speaking colonies of Latin America are independent. They're mostly republics, and Portugal has kicked Brazil has kicked Portugal out of its country, weirdly, and become a monarchy under the son of the King of Portugal, and they also develop a kind of constitutional monarchy along the lines of the Atlantic revolutions. The outcome of the Latin American revolutions is also very different from the other ones. In many ways, it follows the Haitian model, unfortunately, more than it does the United States or the French model. The United States had a democratic revolution that did not bring equality to all people, obviously. We had slavery. Our treatment of Native Americans was incredibly brutal for the next 100 years after the revolution, at least, if not 180 years. And so it was a kind of conservative revolution, although it brought amazing rights and the separation of powers and all the great ideals of the Atlantic revolutions way further forward. And I don't mean to sell short the American Revolution. It was a truly great and useful revolution for all of human history and a model to everyone. It literally was. It just wasn't full equality. The French Revolution, had its big push for equality. It had the Terror. It ended up in Napoleon, and then eventually a constitutional monarchy. Was a kind of more like almost revolution. Like it had a revolution, but then it was returned to constitutional monarchy, and it would take them probably, 100 odd years or 120 odd years to actually get back to full democracy in France without a king or without a monarch or any of that other stuff. And so both of those revolutions, though, the countries were rich and they were powerful. France and the United States remained, or the United States case became powers of their day. And that did not happen in Latin America. What happened was, with the failure of Gran Colombia, you ended up with a bunch of small, fairly poorly developed states, economically speaking. The bad economic management of the Spanish left the Spanish, the new American countries in South America fairly incapable of competing industrially the way that the United States very quickly would. Basically, all of the Latin American countries remained tied to exporting raw materials, whether that was sugar or tobacco or gold or silver or hardwoods or any kind of resource-based stuff. That was, a way that your country could make money, but it wasn't a way to make your country a modern industrial power. And so Spain remained kind of behind, or not Spain, the Latin American countries remained kind of behind the curve, economically speaking, which to some extent they still are today. And the key problem really to some extent beyond that was the fact that after these countries developed, they did not develop into the kind of robust democracy that the United States developed into. For all of its failures, the United States was a democracy, at least for those people able to vote. Whereas in Latin America, you tended to get a kind of fake democracy in a lot of places. You generally had two parties, a liberal and a conservative party, red and blue parties. And at first, those parties had some meaningful distinctions, like the liberals are more in favor of freedom, the conservatives are more conservative. But after a while, those titles became kind of indistinguishable from just team colors. And in a lot of the countries, these two parties took turns basically running the country and robbing it, and then the next party would take over for a while and rob it for a while, and they would just take turns. And so the idea of like a really fully developed democracy in Latin America doesn't really happen for far too long, probably until the Mexican Revolution that ends in 1917, or wherever you want to consider the Mexican Revolution having ended. And so that is obviously a failure. On the other hand, Latin America does ban slavery. And they do make a better effort eventually, particularly in countries to the northern part of Latin America, to try and figure out like how to be halfway inclusive of Native American culture, how to find a way for basically the entire population to try and do well in an economic and rights kind of sense of things. At first, that's just on paper, but over time, those rights do extend to all people in the Latin American countries. So they really are Latin American revolutions. even though they don't succeed fully, as the French and the American revolutions didn't succeed fully. And so that's kind of the whole story in a very short lecture, of like why the revolutions in Latin America happen, the Enlightenment, changes and dislocations brought by Napoleon, what happens, the idea of these leaders, Hidalgo and Bolivar and San Martin, trying to push the Spaniards out, and they do that successfully, and then kind of, not getting to the perfect states that, of course, everybody in the Atlantic revolutions wanted to get to. They got a long way, and they definitely got further than the Spanish had. And for the Bolivians and the Chileans and the Ecuadorians and everybody else, they got their own countries. They were independent and they were free. And any mistakes or inequality or bad judgment that they might make from then on would be their own. And that is the great success of the Latin American revolutions. Thanks.